As dawn broke, the castaways finally got a good look at their situation. They numbered 19, including 2 Eskimo women and Hans Christian's youngest child, Charlie Polaris. Charlie had been born aboard the ship while they were in winter quarters and was named after it. The floe they were stranded on was a mile in diameter, and while it served as a makeshift raft, they didn't know how long it would hold together. From October 1872 to April 1873, the floe drifted south, gradually getting smaller. The most significant break occurred on March 11th, leaving it only 100 yards long and 70 yards wide. They didn't have many provisions to begin with, just 11.5 bags of bread, 14 small hams, cans of meat and soup, some chocolate and sugar, and 630 pounds of pemmican. They had to eat a few dogs that fell on the ice, and some seals they managed to catch to stave off starvation. Luckily, the floe drifted into the whalers' path, and on April 30th, the Tigress of Conception Bay, Newfoundland, rescued them and brought them to St. John's S. The voyage of the Polaris itself offers little to recount. With a crew of 14, she was propelled northward to Lifeboat Cove, where she was securely anchored. The crew promptly disembarked and erected a dwelling on the land, where they spent the winter in relatively comfortable conditions, provided with all the fresh meat they required by the Eskimos. In the spring, they fashioned a pair of vessels from the ship's wood and embarked on June 3rd for the southern lands. They were eventually rescued by the Dundee whaler Ravenscraig. As previously noted, the results of this undertaking could have been much more significant than they were. The Polaris indeed ventured farther north than any previous ship had accomplished. Dr. Bessels conducted many valuable investigations into the fauna and flora of those regions, and definitively demonstrated that Kane's open polar sea and Hayes's coastline were entirely fictitious. However, greater achievements could have been attained if the expedition had been better directed. Chapter 21. The Germania and the Hansa. In the previous chapter, we witnessed Hall's motivation to venture into Arctic exploration in response to the loss of the Franklin expedition. However, let us now look back to the year 1868, when renowned German geographer Dr. Petermann launched a voyage of discovery along the east coast of Greenland. He prepared a small vessel, the Germania, and achieved the distinction of being the first German to lead an expedition to the polar regions. Captain Karl Koldewey, an expert in maritime matters, commanded the Germania, having studied navigation at the Polytechnic School in Hanover, and physics and astronomy at the University of Göttingen. Koldewey's first trip on the Germania, with an 11-man crew, brought no significant results. Pack ice impeded their attempt to coast northward along the shores of Greenland, forcing them to head eastward to the Spitzbergen Seas, where they reached 81 degrees latitude. They then returned down the Hinlopen Strait, reaching Bergen on the last day of September. The following year, Koldewey embarked on his second expedition, with better provisions and more equipment, accompanied by the Hansa, a schooner commanded by Captain Hegemann. The Germania, a 140-ton screw steamer, was manned by 17 officers and men, while the Hansa had 14. They planned to spend a winter within the Arctic Circle, and thus special attention was given to the commissary department. This expedition set sail with one of the best provisioned ships ever to embark on a voyage of adventure. Progress was slow at first due to heavy gales that persisted through the month's latter half. Nevertheless, the crew persevered, keeping close to one another. By the start of July, they knew they had reached higher latitudes because the sun did not set until 10:15 p.m., and they could read the smallest print at midnight without light. A few days later, off the coast of Jan Mayen Island, they experienced the midnight sun for the first time. Doctors Borgen and Copeland, an Englishman who had studied and worked in Germany, became more fervent in their scientific observations, which would prove to be the most valuable outcome of the expedition. Shortly after, a misunderstanding occurred, separating the two ships permanently. As they sailed together, searching for a passage through the ice that would extend northward, Koldewey signaled Hegemann to confer. However, Hegemann misinterpreted the signal and sailed away into the fog before Koldewey could follow. Hegemann did everything he could to reach Sabine Island, the designated meeting place in case of such an event. But unfavorable weather conditions kept him more than 35 nautical miles away. The Hansa found itself in dire straits, fighting against the ice that was closing in rapidly. Without enough steam power to reach Sabine Island or force a path to the landward water, the ship was forced to lay up between two icefield promontories on September 6th, and on the following day it was completely icebound. The crew had no choice but to spend the winter where they were. They quickly constructed a house of coal bricks, which absorbed dampness and retained warmth. Water and snow served as a substitute for mortar. The house was finished and provisioned for 2 months in just over a week. They completed it just in time, as a gale arose and the ice began to press against the ship. The noise was unpleasant and lasted for days. The ship trembled violently, and the masts swayed. The pressure of the ice was so terrible that the deck seams sprung, and the bow of the ship rose 17 feet. The rising of the ship was an extraordinary and awful yet splendid spectacle. The crew took their belongings to the landing bridge, but the after part of the ship would not rise. The stern post bore the most frightful pressure, and the crew knew the ship would soon break up. The first task was to bring all necessary and useful items from the lower decks to the ice. This included bedding, clothing, provisions, and coal. Heavy chests and barrels were pushed over the hatchway. The weighty iron galley came first, followed by the 2 stoves, which ensured hot food and heating for the coal house. Soon the cabin was flooded, and all movable articles were floating. The fear of not having enough fuel made the crew grab any loose piece of wood and throw it on the ice. The ship's sinking was imperceptible, finding support on a tongue of ice or a promontory of the field. A few other items, such as the cabin lamp, books, cigars, and game boxes, were still on board, which would be great treasures in their future position. The snow roof and sails were brought onto the ice, but there was still work to be done. A chaotic mess of various articles surrounded the ship, and groups of feeble rats struggled and died in the cold. Gradually the crew settled down for the winter in their fairly comfortable, though not particularly secure, winter home. Occasionally they had a bad fright. On January 2nd, as they rested after dinner, they heard a scraping, blustering, crackling, sawing, grating, and jarring sound, as if some unhappy ghost was wandering under their floe. Perplexed, they all jumped up and went out, thinking that their storehouse had fallen in. Some sailors searched the path to it with a lamp, but they saw nothing when the light fell on the sparkling and glittering ice walls. The rigid icicles hung immovably, and nothing seemed amiss. They rummaged in the snow path before the house, but they could not see more than the steps, or hear anything but the howling of the storm. Still, they could detect the same rubbing and grinding. One of the members wrote, "We lay flat on our stomachs with our ears pressed to the floor, and the sound that met us was like the song of ice when it's tightly packed, with the unmistakable sound of water running beneath our great floe. It was clear that our position was in great danger of being crushed into pieces, either from drifting over sunken rocks and bursting, or breaking over the ice border, or perhaps both. We packed our furs and filled our knapsacks with provisions, but even then, our outlook was bleak if the floe should be destroyed." The following morning we discovered that huge masses of the floe that surrounded our house had broken off, and it was not until the storm cleared the next day that we could take stock of the situation. What we saw was nothing short of horrifying. The floe had shrunk to half its size. The distance from our house to the edge of the ice, which was once 500 paces, was now only 200, with the exception of one side where the distance had diminished to 1,000 from 3,000 paces before the storm. The diameter of the floe, which was 2 nautical miles before the storm, was now barely 1. But the worst was yet to come. On January 11th, splits appeared in the immediate vicinity of our house, and the floe was reduced to a mere 150 feet in diameter. On this frail raft, we experienced one of the most terrible storms we had ever encountered, and it was a miracle that we escaped with our lives. By the beginning of February, our ordeal was practically over, and we had borne it with remarkable patience. During this entire time we had been drifting steadily south within sight of the barren shore of Greenland, which unfortunately the ice never allowed us to reach. On May 7th, the sea cleared, and we eagerly seized the opportunity to take to our boats. On June 7th, we arrived at Friedrichsthal, where we were warmly welcomed by the Moravian missionaries. Eventually, we secured a passage home from Julianshab, a seaport on the west coast of South Greenland. Meanwhile, Koldewey had to find a harbor for his ship off Pendulum Islands, since the Hansa didn't arrive. While sailing home in the summer, he discovered the magnificent Franz Josef Fjord, at the head of which Mount Petermann rears its head to a height of at least 12,000 feet above the sea. Chapter 22. The Tegethoff. Many routes to the North Pole had been tried and found wanting. The expedition started out by Bering Strait, through Smith Sound, up the eastern coast of Greenland, and from Spitzbergen, but they were all frustrated by the Arctic currents. These currents carried so much ice that real progress towards the pole was impossible. There was still one route that had scarcely been tried, which lay around the northeast shores of Nova Zembla. Many noted geographers held that the Gulf Stream did not disappear at the North Cape. By following its warmer waters, it might be possible to avoid the Arctic currents and the difficulties which followed in their train. It was with a view to testing this theory that the Austrian expedition of 1872 to 1874 set out in the Tegethoff. The expedition was under the joint command of Lieutenant Karl Weiprecht and Lieutenant Julius Peyer. The former was entrusted with all matters connected with navigation, and the latter was responsible for the conduct of the sledding operations. In June 1871, Weiprecht and Peyer sailed in the Isbjorn on a preliminary excursion to check out the land, or rather, perhaps, the sea. The result of their observations being entirely satisfactory, it was decided that they should adventure in that direction in the following year. The Tegethoff, a steamer of 220 tons, was accordingly put in a state of thorough repair and fitted out for 2.5 years. Her crew numbered 22, so that with her commanders she carried 24 souls, as well as 8 dogs. The expedition sailed from Tromsø on July 14th, and 11 days later ice was sighted. At first it afforded them no serious difficulties. The Tegethoff was enabled by her steam power to charge the floes and force her way through those which she could not sail around. On August 20th, however, she was brought to a dead stop by a barrier of ice. Ominous were the events of that day, says Peyer, for immediately after we had made the Tegethoff fast to that floe, the ice closed in upon us from all sides, and we became close prisoners in its grasp. No water was to be seen around us, and never again were we destined to see our vessel in the water. We were, in fact, no longer discoverers, but passengers against our will on the ice. From day to day, we hoped for the hour of our deliverance. At first we expected it hourly, then daily, then from week to week, then at the seasons of the year and changes of the weather, then in the chances of New Year's. But that hour never came. The Tegethoff, firmly fixed on her floe, now became the sport of the winds. By October 12th, she had traveled so far northward that Nova Zembla had completely disappeared from view. On the next day, a great excitement took place, for the floe burst right under the ship. Rushing on deck, says Peyer, we discovered that we were surrounded and squeezed by the ice. The after part of the ship was already nipped and pressed, and the rudder shook and groaned. But as its great weight did not admit of its being shipped, we were content to lash it firmly. We next sprang on the ice, the tossing, tremulous motion of which literally filled the air with noises, as of shrieks and howls, and we quickly got on board all the materials that were lying on the floe, and bound the fissures of the ice hastily together by ice anchors and cables. But just as in the risings of a people, the wave of revolt spreads on every side, so now the ice uprose against us. The party on the Tegethoff remained for the whole of the winter on the brink of death. When summer came, it brought with it hopes of release, but day after day passed by, and still the floe on which the ship was fixed showed no signs of freeing her from its grasp. In July 1873, an attempt was made to measure the thickness of the ice by means of a borer. After 27 feet had been penetrated, the attempt had to be abandoned. In August, the chances of release began to lessen considerably. The bitter thought was beginning to assail the officers and crew that they would be obliged to return home without making a single discovery. On the 30th of the month, a sudden and unexpected sight infused new life into them. "About midday," says Peary, "as we were leaning on the bulwarks of the ship and scanning the gliding mists, through which the rays of the sun broke ever and anon, a wall of mist, lifting itself up suddenly, revealed to us afar off in the northwest the outlines of bold rocks, which in a few minutes seemed to grow into a radiant alpine land. There was now not a sick man on board the Tegethoff. The news of the discovery spread in an instant. Everyone rushed on deck to convince himself with his own eyes that the expedition was not, after all, a failure. There before us lay the prize that could not be snatched from us." Chapter 23. Nares and Smith Sound. After Sir Edward Belcher's expedition returned in 1854, the British government left Arctic research to Germans, Austrians, Americans, and private individuals until 1874. At that time, the government realized its responsibility to explore the 2.5 million square miles around the pole that people had never documented. Scientists were concerned that the cause and tracking of storms and other information concerning the sea could not be obtained without exploring the area. In April 1875, 2 ships, the Alert and the Discovery, were commissioned for the expedition, and Captain George S. Nares was appointed to command. They were fitted with modern appliances and provisioned for 3 years. The expedition included officers such as Albert H. Markham, Pelham Aldrich, and Henry F. Stevenson. On May 29, 1875, the 2 ships, accompanied by the storeship Valorous, set sail from Portsmouth. After taking on additional supplies and 24 Greenland dogs at Godhaven, they shipped more dogs and drivers at Rittenbank and again at Provan. They reached Port Fulk on July 28th and found the entrance to Smith Sound ice-free. The ships were beset in the ice for several days at Peyer Harbor, a little south of Cape Sabine. Stevenson explored Falk Fjord, while Nares visited Littleton Island and Lifeboat Cove and examined the cache left behind by the Polaris. The journey northward was challenging due to bad ice, and the ships were either beset in it or occupied with charging their way through it. They made their way up the channel, caching large stores of provisions as they went. Nares had to correct errors on Hayes's chart, which was a perpetual annoyance to him. Cape Fraser and Scoresby Bay were placed too far north, and the rest of the western coast was poorly delineated. Nares hugged the western shore, taking advantage of every channel that opened near the ship. He reached Lady Franklin Bay, on the other side of which he found a landlocked inlet that he named Discovery Harbor. He left his companionship there while he pushed on in the Alert. As he ascended the strait, he observed that the character of the ice changed rapidly. He was in the middle of the ice formed in the Polar Sea, now known as Paleocrystic, and was the first man really to understand its character. The Alert succeeded in making her way as far as Floberg Reach, in latitude 82 degrees 25 north, longitude 62 degrees west, the highest point yet attained by a ship. Though the situation seemed exposed, it was well protected by a fringe of heavy floes grounded in 8 to 12 fathoms of water. No land was seen to the northward, and Nares was forced to conclude that, though he had reached the shores of the Arctic Ocean, it was the very reverse of that open polar sea that he had hoped to find. On September 16th, the ship was frozen in for the winter. 10 days later, Captain Markham, Lieutenant Parr, and Lieutenant May set off on a sledding expedition to establish depots of provisions as far north as possible. They accomplished their work well, but 7 men and 1 officer returned badly frostbitten, and amputations were necessary in 3 cases. The winter was bitterly cold, with a mean temperature for 5 days and 9 hours of 66.29 degrees below zero. For 2 separate periods of 15 days each, the mercury remained frozen. As soon as April came around, Nares sent out 2 great sled parties. One pushed as far north as possible, while the other explored the northern shores of Grinnell Land. Markham's journey was one of the most extraordinary on record. Instead of advancing at a steady walk, half of each day was spent by the whole party facing the sled and dragging it forward a few feet at a time. The maximum advance rate was slightly less than 3 miles per day, and the mean rate was 1¼ miles. The distance from the ship to their farthest point was only 73 miles, but on the outward and homeward journeys they covered 521 miles. Aldrich's expedition also suffered severely from scurvy, but explored the northern shores of Grinnell Land for 220 miles, reaching latitude 82 degrees 16 minutes north, 86 degrees west. Nares sent out Lieutenant May and 2 sailors to relieve him. Lieutenant Beaumont's expedition from the Discovery also nearly ended in disaster from scurvy. He reached latitude 82 degrees 20 minutes north, 51 degrees west. But on the homeward journey, he found the ice too rotten to permit them to cross to the Alert. 36 cases of scurvy were reported on the Alert alone, and Nares decided to return as soon as he could break out of winter quarters. He was released at the end of July, and in October both ships reached England safely. They had opened up great tracts of entirely new country. Chapter 24. The Tragedy of the Greely. Lieutenant Charles Weyprecht's voyage in the Tegethoff yielded immediate and long-term benefits. He returned from his daring expedition brimming with ideas for revolutionizing the methods of Arctic exploration. Prior to this time, each nation or group operated independently, disregarding the scientific and geographical work of others. No one attempted to solve the mysteries of the Arctic regions through joint efforts. However, in 1875, Weyprecht presented a proposal before the German Scientific and Medical Association of Graz. He suggested that the principal nations involved in Arctic research establish a network of stations encircling the pole. These stations would conduct simultaneous observations to gather data. Of the 15 stations eventually erected, Denmark, Germany, Russia, and the United States claimed 2 each. Austria-Hungary, Finland, France, Great Britain, Holland, Norway, and Sweden secured 1 station each. Additionally, 34 permanent observatories pledged to cooperate. As a result, skilled scientists at 49 different stations, all located within or near the polar regions, conducted significant simultaneous observations during the following years. We need not bother ourselves with the particulars of most of these expeditions. Their work was purely scientific, and those interested may peruse the 31 quarto volumes of the International Polar Scientific Publications. This set comprises the most extensive collection of scientific Arctic data in existence. The expedition that concerns us is the one sent by America, led by Lieutenant A. West Greely. Its mission was to establish a station in Lady Franklin Bay, on the east coast of Grinnell Land, in the area visited by Nares in 1875. In summary, the plan was for Greely, a lieutenant in the signaling department of the United States Army, to lead a party of 25 aboard the Proteus, a 467-ton sealer, in the spring of 1881. The Proteus was to sail directly to Lady Franklin Bay, where the team would disembark, and then return to America. It was agreed that a vessel would bring supplies to the station in 1882, and again in 1883. In case the vessel failed to reach the party's base, it would deposit provisions on the east coast of Grinnell Land and establish a depot on Littleton Island. If no vessel arrived at Lady Franklin Bay in 1882, the one dispatched in 1883 would stay in Smith Sound for as long as conditions allowed. Before leaving, the crew would drop off a team at Littleton Island with everything required for a winter's sojourn, hoping to ensure Greely's and his men's safety. Regrettably, it appears that the cabinet minister in charge of the team's equipment was not overly supportive of the expedition. The meager funds allotted to the group were insufficient. Consequently, Greely had to be exceedingly frugal when procuring supplies. In addition, numerous vexatious and needless holdups in delivering documents and other paperwork meant that he had to hastily complete his preparations within an inconveniently brief span of time. During their early days at Fort Conger, the team embarked on short sled expeditions, depositing stores of provisions at Cape Beechey and Cape Murchison. Under the direction of the astronomer Israel, they zealously pursued scientific inquiries, yielding many invaluable findings. When spring returned, sledding expeditions set off in all directions, resulting in some peculiar experiences for members of the team. For instance, the doctor of the mission, Pavy, and a small group embarked on a voyage of discovery in the direction of the Alert's winter quarters, which they reached unscathed. 8 days later, however, they foolishly took shelter on an iceberg during a storm. To their dread, the gale severed their berg from the main pack, and it sailed towards the north. They had reached latitude 82 degrees 56 north, and began to despair of ever returning when their raft, fortunately, drifted towards the shore, which they only managed to reach with considerable difficulty. While Pavey and his companions embarked on their hazardous voyage, Lieutenant J.B. Lockwood, one of the most indefatigable members of the team, undertook an extraordinary journey up the west coast of Greenland. On April 3rd, he departed Fort Conger with orders to explore the coast near Cape Britannia, and then proceed in any direction he deemed appropriate. The ice was rough, the gales were fierce, and the cold was extreme, the thermometer plunging as low as 81 degrees below freezing point at times. In spite of these difficulties, he pushed on rapidly, arriving at Cape Bryant on April 27th. There he sent all of his men back except Sergeant Brainerd and Christensen, with whom he pressed forward with renewed fervor. Chapter 25. The work of Adolf Erik Nordenskjöld. Adolf Erik Nordenskjöld is one of the most famous men in the scientific exploration of the polar regions. He collected valuable data and made discoveries on his numerous voyages to the Arctic world. His explorations not only enriched the scientific and geographical knowledge, but also opened up new paths for the mercantile world. Nordenskjöld was born in Helsingfors, Finland, on November 18, 1832. His father was a well-known naturalist and mining department head of Finland. Nordenskjöld received his early training in science from his father, and he became one of the leading mineralogists in Sweden. In 1864, he led an expedition to Spitzbergen, where he rediscovered Vikeland and explored the unknown regions to the north of the island. He came across a boatload of shipwrecked walrus hunters and had to give them assistance, which kept him from pursuing his original intention. The Swedish government concluded that it had done enough in the way of Arctic research for the present, but Nordenskjöld had acquired a taste for Arctic travel. He approached Count Ehrensvard, the governor of Gothenburg, who raised a fund that enabled him to depart on an expedition during the course of which he succeeded in attaining a higher point than any explorer in the Old World had reached in a ship. Nordenskjöld continued his research with a far larger expedition than any of its predecessors. He wintered on the north coast of Spitzbergen and examined northeast land with a view to determining its geological structure and settling its eastern limit. He also opened up a way to China along the coast of Asia. Nordenskjöld was determined to make the complete voyage from Tromsø to the Bering Strait. He obtained a grant from the Swedish Parliament and contributions from Oscar Dixon, King Oscar, and Monsieur Sibiriakov, which enabled him to fit out the Vega. He set sail from Tromsø on July 21, 1878, accompanied by 3 ships. The Kara Strait and the Kara Sea were safely negotiated, and Nordenskjöld rounded Cape Chelyuskin, the most northerly point of Asia, and passed the new Siberian islands. He was within 120 miles of his destination when his ship was caught in the ice, and had to abandon all hopes of getting free that winter. The Vega was the first ship to accomplish the difficult passage in a single journey. Now, Garlington's actions take a turn for the worse. He arrived at Littleton Island, a place where provisions were abundant, and instead of stocking up for the winter, he insisted on immediately setting off to meet the Yantic. Despite other offers and advice to wait for a few days, Garlington refused to delay his departure. This decision proved disastrous when the Yantic arrived 3 days after he had left, having missed him on the way. Captain Wild had no choice but to search for the crew of the Proteus, eventually finding them on the coast of Greenland. The harrowing tale of the Greely expedition contains a few troubling chapters, which have been omitted from most histories of Arctic exploration. Lieutenant Garlington and the Secretary for War of that day, Mr. Robert T. Lincoln, were responsible for some of the expedition's darkest moments. In the summer of 1883, the Proteus set off on a mission to bring Greely home or to establish an ample depot of provisions on Littleton Island. Garlington, who had volunteered for the service, was placed at the head of the expedition. The Yantic, which was to accompany the Proteus, sailed with boilers in poor repair, and was forced to visit a Greenland port early on. Consequently, the Yantic was unable to accompany the Proteus far north, as originally planned. Garlington, while prospecting from a hill not far from Pear Harbor, saw a lead of open water through what had been solid ice, and he ordered Captain Pike to proceed up it. Pike was hesitant, but Garlington insisted, and the Proteus was caught in the ice and sank. Garlington then proceeded to Littleton Island, where he could have formed a splendid depot of provisions for the explorers whom he must have known would be in dire straits during the winter. Yet, he started off at once in his boats to meet the Yantic, leaving behind a message for Greely reporting the loss of the Proteus, stating that he was rejoining the Yantic, and adding that everything in the power of man should be done to rescue him. The Yantic eventually reached Littleton Island 3 days after Garlington and his men had left it. Lieutenant Caldwell had offered to go off in the whaler to meet the Yantic, while Garlington laid in a store of provisions, but his offer was rejected. Pike urged Garlington to wait for a few days, as there could be no doubt that the Yantic would cross Melville Bay in safety. But his advice was also rejected. The Yantic made a good passage home, and even then it would have been easy to equip and send out a special vessel to Cape Sabine, for whaling captains all agreed that a boat leaving New York as late as September 19th could reach Cape Sabine in safety. General Hazen, the chief signal officer, entreated Lincoln to purchase and dispatch a vessel at once, but nothing was done. Lieutenant Melville offered to take a party there himself, but his offer was not accepted. Shortly afterwards, Lincoln expressed his conviction that it was now too late. As events proved, Melville Bay was navigable that year for 45 days after that too late was uttered, and many of Greely's companions paid for the mistake with their lives. Although no one would accuse Garlington or Lincoln of willfully sacrificing the lives of their fellow men, it is extraordinary that while they knew that there was the barest likelihood of Greely and his men starving to death on a barren and inhospitable shore where there was no chance of their obtaining food, they neglected to use their utmost effort to save them. The voyage of the Jeannette has a dual significance. Not only is it a harrowing tragedy in the annals of Arctic exploration, but it inspired Nansen's plan to reach the pole by drifting north with the current. The expedition was launched by Mr. J.G. Bennett of the New York Herald, who had a fervent interest in Arctic research and had financed previous expeditions. He purchased the Pandora, renamed it the Jeannette, and placed it in the hands of Commander DeLong, a member of the relief expedition for the Polaris. The Jeannette was superbly equipped for both navigation and scientific research, and departed from San Francisco on July 8, 1879, after a stop at St. Michael's to take on sleds, furs, dogs, and Alaskan dog drivers. The plan was to spend the winter at Wrangel Land and then venture further north, potentially to the pole. However, the Wrangel Land marked on maps did not exist, and DeLong was doomed to never reach it. Geographers had believed for over 100 years that a vast continent extended from the north of Asia to Greenland, based on reports from the Chukchi people. Even renowned cartographer Peterman upheld the theory, and the discovery of Wrangel Land by American whaler Thomas Long in 1867 seemed to confirm the existence of this vast continent. DeLong had every reason to expect comfortable winter quarters there, but it was not to be. Soon he was to be let down, as before he was even close to land, the Jeannette was trapped in the ice. From then on, her story was a painful echo of the Tegethoffs, with none of its rewards. Continuously drifting to the west by the ever-moving pack ice, now sewn in until her seams almost burst, she was now threatened with destruction by the frozen waves of ice that rolled down upon her. She was reduced to an unfortunate situation. Here is the depiction written by her chief engineer, G. West Melville, of an event that happened nearly every day. During the wind's persistence, the whole body of ice moved evenly before it. But when it subsided, the mass that had been put in motion crowded and tumbled upon the far-off floes at rest, piling tumultuously upward in a manner terrific to behold. In one of these oppressive intervals, succeeding a gale when the roar and crash of the distant masses could be distinctly heard, the floe in which the Jeannette was embedded began splitting in all directions. The calm and almost level surface of ice suddenly heaved and swelled into great hills, buzzing and wheezing dolefully. Giant blocks pitched and rolled as though controlled by invisible hands, and the vast compressing bodies shrieked a shrill and horrible song that curdled the blood. On came the frozen waves, nearer and nearer. Seams ran and rattled across them with a thundering boom, while silent and awestruck, we watched their terrible progress. The ship lay sunk in an amphitheater about 5/8 of a mile in diameter. The bank of moving ice puffed in places to a height of 50 feet, gradually enclosing her on all sides. Preparations were made for her abandonment, but what then? If the mighty circle continued to decrease, escape was hopeless, death inevitable. To think of clambering up the slippery sides of the rolling mass would be equal folly with an attempt to scale the falling waters of Niagara. Summer arrived after winter, but brought no hope to the cursed crew of the Jeannette. They had already passed the northern coast of Wrangel Land, finding only a small island, and there was no sign of the mythical continent DeLong had hoped for. The new year found them still trapped in the pack ice. DeLong wrote in his diary, "People trapped in the pack ice always drifted to some land, but we are drifting like a modern Flying Dutchman, going nowhere, but always moving. Coal is burning, food is being consumed, pumps are still going, and 33 people are wearing out their lives and souls like prisoners. If this summer passes like the last, what reasonable mind can be patient with the future?" On May 16th they found 2 islands, which they named Jeannette and Henriette. DeLong went on a sledding expedition to them, but had trouble with his dogs, who refused to cross open water and had to be dragged through every lead. "There is no greater violence done to the eternal cause of truth," he said, "than in those pictures where the Eskimos are represented as calmly sitting in shoe-shaped sleds, with the lashes of their whips trailing gracefully behind, while the dogs dash in full cry and perfect unison across smooth expanses of snow." On Sunday, June 12th, the ship finally gave way under the immense pressure and began to fill with water. The crew quickly gathered everything they would need for their journey to safety on the ice. At 4 o'clock the next morning, the man on watch began shouting that the Jeannette was sinking. As the ship slipped deeper, the crew watched as it disappeared beneath the icy waves. With 9 sleds and 5 boats, the crew set off on their 150-mile journey to the New Siberian Islands. Though they had 60 days' worth of provisions, the weakened crew had to cover each mile 7 times, and a northerly drift pushed them off course. Despite the challenges, they eventually reached the islands and rested briefly before embarking on a 7-day journey to the Lena Delta with only 7 days' worth of provisions. Sadly, a storm separated the 3 boats, and Lieutenant Chips and his men were never heard from again. DeLong and Melville's crews faced their own challenges, including unfordable tributaries and the loss of their boat. They were forced to wait until the ice bridged over the streams before continuing on their journey. Finally, on September 16, 1881, DeLong and his companions landed near the mouth of the Lena and began a 95-mile march to the nearest settlement. On October 6th, the first death occurred, and on the following day, the miserable party ate their last provisions. To press forward was impossible for most of them, weakened and ill as they had become, while to stay meant certain death. DeLongitude and Ambler, the party's doctor, decided to send 2 men for help while they heroically stayed behind to care for their dying comrades. The rest of their story can be told best by quoting from the commander's diary. "Missed Lee. Went down a hole in the bank and camped. Sent back for Lee. He had turned back, lain down, and was ready to die. All united in saying Lord's Prayer and Creed after supper. Horrible night. October 17th, Monday, 127th day. Alexei dying. Doctor baptized him. Read prayers for sick. Mr. Collins' birthday, 40 years old. About sunset, Alexei died. Exhaustion from starvation. October 22nd, Saturday, 132nd day. Too weak to carry the bodies of Lee and Kayak out on the ice. The doctor, Collins, and I carried them round the corner out of sight. Then my eye closed up. October 30th, Sunday, 140th day. Boyd and Gortz died during the night. Mr. Collins dying. And tragically, the brave commander's diary ends here. Some months later, Melville, who had made his way to the coast in a less inhospitable region, organized a search party as soon as he heard of DeLongitude's plight and came upon the camp. "I saw 3 things," he says. "One of them was a hand and arm sticking out of the snow. I recognized DeLong by his coat. He was on his right side, right hand under his cheek, head pointing north, face towards the west. His feet were drawn up like he was asleep. His left arm was raised, elbow bent, hand lifted and bare. 4 feet behind him to the east was his journal, where he had thrown it with his left hand, which looked like it had frozen mid-throw." During his cursed journey, DeLong not only made significant physical observations in an unknown region, but also disproved the theory of a continent north of Asia by revealing the Siberian Ocean to be a shallow basin adorned with islands. Chapter 27. The Hunter Lee Smith and the Era. Spitsbergen and Franz Josef Land owe much of our knowledge of them to the efforts of the skilled yachtsman and hunter Lee Smith, who also saved the Swedes in Mussel Bay. Smith began exploring the Arctic in the 1870s, correcting errors about the outline of northeast land during 3 voyages along Spitsbergen's coast. However, it was not until his 1880 expedition to Franz Josef Land that his work captured attention. Smith believed that perseverance and seizing opportunities could lead to discoveries in the icy seas, and his steam yacht Era allowed him to conduct research over a large area. He set sail with 29 others in June 1880, intending to examine Jan Mayen's island, but it was shrouded in a thick mist. He then turned to the east coast of Greenland, which was too heavily encumbered by ice for him to approach. He set his course for Spitsbergen. But upon meeting David and John Gray, he learned that the ice was equally treacherous in that direction. So Lee Smith decided to try his luck in the Barents Sea and determine once and for all if there was a viable sea route to Franz Josef Land. Peyer and Weiprecht had already found their way there in 1871, but they drifted there with the ice. De Bruyn sighted its highland in 1879, but he failed to reach it. Captain Markham pushed as far north as latitude 78 degrees in his yacht, the Isbjorn, and concluded that a steamer could make its way through the loose ice with which the sea was cumbered without much difficulty. With hope, Lee Smith embarked on a journey to reach those shores that had never been visited since they were first discovered. Despite the ice-covered sea and frequent dense fogs, Lee Smith brought the Era through safely. On August 14th, she anchored off May Island to the south of Hooker Island. Continuing her journey, she steamed past Barents Hook, around the southern shore of Northbrook Island, and up to Bell Island, between which and Mabel Island an excellent anchorage was found and named Era Harbor. Making that his base, Lee Smith surveyed the coastline in all directions, adding about 110 miles to the maps and forming an interesting collection of the country's flora and fauna. Towards the end of August, the weather became threatening, so he decided to bid farewell to Franz Josef Land for that year, as he was not prepared to spend a winter there. To convince doubters that the voyage to Franz Josef Land would be practicable in any year, he set out on his second voyage the following summer. The Era was more hampered by ice than before, but on July 23rd, land was sighted, and Lee Smith set his course for Cape Ludlow. After exploring much of the coastline he had been unable to reach during his previous visit, he made for Bell Island, which he anchored on August 6th. After surveying Cape Flora, he pondered heading eastward to locate any signs of the lost Jeanette. However, fate had other plans. On a serene Sunday, when all seemed well, the pack ice suddenly surged with the tide, trapping the Era between it and the land flow. The grounded berg initially offered protection, but it eventually crumbled, causing the Era to list and water to inundate the hull, likely from an ice tongue puncture. Despite attempts to use the pumps, the water prevailed, and within 2 hours the Era succumbed to the depths, settling in 11 fathoms of water. Hopeless and stranded, the crew adapted to their new reality and readied themselves for winter. Fortunately, the region teemed with wildlife, including bears and walruses, and with the aid of their clever retriever, Bob, they amassed enough provisions to sustain them until spring. Bob's hunting prowess proved indispensable. He once stumbled upon a herd of walruses and promptly alerted his companions, providing a vital food source. On another occasion, he lured a bear straight to their doorstep, enabling them to dispatch it with ease. However, in his fervor, he nearly perished when a dying bear nearly tore him limb from limb. Fortunately, the boats were saved. Winter was spent preparing for a voyage to Nova Zembla, where they hoped to find aid. Their hope was fulfilled. After 6 hard weeks, they met the Dutch steamer, Willem Barents, and later the Hope, sent by the British government for their relief. They returned home unharmed. Lee Smith's voyages were valuable scientifically and commercially, as he showed the abundance of walruses in those seas, which hunters have taken advantage of. Chapter 28. Nansen, Peary, and Greenland. On the face of the planet, there's hardly a more desolate and unwelcoming place than Greenland. Stretching over 1,400 miles north to south and almost 900 miles east to west at its widest point, nearly all of it is covered by a permanent ice cap, reaching depths of up to 3,000 feet in some areas, rendering human habitation impossible. A handful of Eskimo tribes and settlers inhabit small sections of the coast, where remnants of the early Norse discoverers, likely Christians, remain. Holm, in 1880, discovered the ruins of 4 stone churches in the Julianshab area. However, these settlements are restricted to small enclaves along the western coast. The eastern coast, except for a small tract between Cape Bismarck and Cape Farewell, where a few Eskimos migrated from the Peary Islands, is entirely uninhabited. The eastern coast is protected by an almost impenetrable ice barrier, and is perpetually shrouded in fog, which has hindered exploration efforts by daring travelers for generations. During the earlier days of Arctic exploration, Hudson, the Dane Daniel, Gale Hamke, Han Agati and his son, Olson Waller, and other whalers mapped out limited sections of the coast, but their discoveries were not significant. However, in 1822, Captain William Scoresby, Jr., a renowned Scottish whaler, charted and sketched the coast from Hudson's Cape Hold with Hope to Gale Hamke Bay while fishing. He also made valuable astronomical and trigonometrical observations. Captain Edward Sabine explored much of the coast in the neighborhood of Pendulum Island with Captain Clavering while engaged in his great pendulum work of 1823, opening up a field that Coldaway later developed during his voyage on the Germania. For centuries, little was known of the great ice cap that makes up the interior, and it remained untouched by human feet. The Eskimos believed it to be the home of sorcerers, known as Kivitogs, and they wouldn't dare to enter it. Even the explorers who dared to venture upon it were rarely successful. In 1870, Nordenskiold and Berggren, a naturalist, managed to penetrate it 35 miles from Aulitsivik Fjord. They discovered a true ice plant and cryoconite, a dust of cosmic origin named by the geologist. In 1883, Nordenskiold tried again and reached 48 degrees after 15 hikes at an elevation of 4,900 feet. Unable to proceed much farther, he sent 2 laps on skis who covered another 140 miles. They reported that even though they had reached an elevation of 6,600 feet, the ice field continued to rise steadily. The first man to cross Greenland from one coast to the other was Dr. Fridtjof Nansen. He later gained fame for his daring attempt to cross the North Pole in the Aram. Nansen was born on October 16, 1861, and from his earliest youth, he displayed a keen interest in natural science and absolute contempt for danger. In 1887, while working as a curator at the Bergen Museum, he announced his intention to cross the ice cap that had defied even the bravest explorers. The announcement was met with ridicule, but he received over 40 applications from potential companions. A generous Dane presented him with the estimated cost of the expedition, which was 300 pounds. No sooner had it become possible for him to execute his plans than he began the preparations for his journey. He had to select his companions, plan the route he intended to take, and prepare the equipment he would need. Additionally, he thought it wise to test the various types of skis and snowshoes that he would be using, and prepare himself for the hardships he would face by sleeping on a snow mountain with only a bag to protect him from the cold. There were to be 5 companions on this daring journey. They included Otto Sverdrup, a retired ship captain, Lieutenant Dietrichson of the Norwegian Army, Christian Christiansen Frana, a North Norwegian peasant, and 2 Lapps named Balto and Ravna. Nansen's plan was audacious. He intended to land on the east coast of Greenland and make his way to the west. Once they embarked on the journey, they could not turn back. Ahead of them lay civilization and food, but behind them lay an uninhabited and inhospitable coast, where they would die of starvation should they return to it. By choosing this route, Nansen burned his boats behind him. In May 1888, Nansen and his companions sailed from Norway on a seal-hunting vessel that would take them to Greenland. They had made an agreement with the captain that business would come first, and he would not go out of his way to land them. As a result, it wasn't until July 17th, when the ship was within 2.5 miles of the shore, that the explorers could finally set off in their 2 boats. As we've mentioned before, the east coast of Greenland is typically obstructed with ice, and Nansen discovered that reaching the shore was nowhere near as easy as he had predicted. Drifting for days with the pack, it carried them as far as 30 miles out to sea, and finally they landed on July 29th. But they couldn't immediately cross the ice cap. Their wanderings had taken them 200 miles south, so they had to journey northward, a toilsome trek that lasted until August 10th, when they could finally set their course for the west coast. They soon discovered that travel by day was impossible. The snow was too soft, and progress was slow, even at night. The rough and uneven ice, frequently intersected by chasms, made each march treacherous. Rain fell in torrents. As they ascended toward the high plateau of central Greenland, the cold grew more intense, and the ice became firmer. Travel by day became possible, but the lack of drinking water was a serious problem. They had to melt snow in flasks carried at their breasts. The 3-week upward journey was painfully steep. Dragging 5 sleds was exhausting. It took so much time that Nansen decided to change his course. Instead of continuing on to Christianshavn, he headed for Godthab, his nearest point in a southwesterly direction. The second half of the journey was a pleasant contrast to the first. They abandoned the largest sled and bound the others together in couples, setting sail and racing down the slope on skis. As they neared the coast, they had to proceed more cautiously. They almost tumbled down the first of the precipices that break up the ice cap at this point. With great effort, they arrived at the shore and split up. Nansen, Sverdrup, and a Laplander crafted an uncomfortable boat out of willows and sailed to New Herrnhut, an Eskimo settlement, where they were welcomed by a missionary. A group was sent back for the others, who arrived safely on October 16th. Nansen planned to return to Norway in the fall, but the last ship had left, so he had to spend the winter in Godthab. He eventually made it home in May, having accomplished what was believed to be impossible, and proved that the interior of Greenland was an enormous ice field. The journey was more expensive than anticipated, but private donations covered the shortfall. At the time, Peary was also attempting to solve the mystery of central Greenland. Before Nansen set out, the brilliant American lieutenant had already begun a series of explorations on the inland ice, which would eventually yield remarkable findings. Peary, a native of Maine and an engineer in the United States Navy, was destined for the life of an Arctic explorer. As Sir Clements Markham noted, he combined forethought and prudence with great skill and unwavering determination, qualities essential for success in exploration. In 1885, he turned his attention seriously to central Greenland, realizing that there was a vast field for research there. He proposed an expedition to the academies and learned societies of the United States to pursue scientific investigations in the virtually unknown country and determine whether Greenland was an island. The idea was enthusiastically embraced, and sufficient funds were raised to enable him to carry out his plans.